It gives me enormous personal and professional pleasure that Marjorie has also devoted her expertise and her friendship to American art. And she has studied and written about the graphic work of John Singleton Copley, John James Audubon, John Singer Sargent, and William Merritt Chase. Her essay about Chase's pastels, which was entitled Assimilating Modernism, appeared in the 2006 volume of the Chase catalog, Raisonné. And judging from the numbers of questions I've gotten regarding Chase's remarkable pastels, many of which we're fortunate to have in our exhibition, I know we're all very much looking forward to her lecture this afternoon on the pastels of William Merritt Chase. Thank you so much. Marjorie.
Thank you, and I want to express my sense of honor in being this year's recipient of the Barbara and Burton Stern lecture series. Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. Sorry about that. I share the same enthusiasm as many of you do for the art of William Merritt Chase, especially his pastels. And this has been a pleasure to work on and have the opportunity to look at his pastels more closely. I think I should start out by saying that Chase was all about technique, and I encourage you, I hope this inspires you to go back and look at his pastels more closely and see some of the things that I have discovered and noted in his technique. Okay. In the early 1800s, to counter American criticism of his subdued tonal paintings and bold Old Master style that he had acquired in Munich during 6 years of academic study in the previous decade, William Merritt Chase adopted new subject matter, a new palette, and a new manner of handling his materials. It was also at this time, I'll show you some of his earlier work that he was doing in Munich. It was also at this time that he turned to pastel, which only recently had emerged as a popular medium. Although oil painting remained his primary pursuit over the next 2 decades, he executed over 100 works in these demanding powdery sticks of color, ranging from small cabinet pictures to monumental compositions. My presentation this afternoon will focus on what it was about the properties of pastel as a creative medium that appealed to Chase and artists of his generation, and how he used it to create a highly personal style that synthesized the many competing trends of the day: Impressionism, Japonisme, the art of the past, and the realism of his training. Pastel was also the perfect vehicle for his eclecticism, for just as he championed a pictorial dialogue with the art of Europe and artists of the past, he defined originality as the blending of many sources, a philosophy that supported his hybrid style of draftsmanship and painterly facture. Pastel, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself with these slides. In any case, pastel, praised for its jewel-like he was praised for his jewel-like landscapes and still lifes, portraiture, interior views, and urban parks in which modern women stroll at leisure. Chase was a cosmopolitan figure with a vast network of American and transatlantic friendships. A constant publicist for the dignity of the artist and for himself as a bohemian gentleman, a dynamic teacher of thousands of students and a leader in elevating the art of pastel to a new echelon of importance. His adoption of the medium was purposeful. It played an important role in his art and fulfilled his complex and ongoing strategy of self-definition as a progressive artist and attracting a market for his work. And just to give you a little background about what pastel was and what led up to the new appreciation of this medium. After almost a century of being neglected because of its association with the French monarchy and disdain for its colorful palette as neoclassicism rose in prestige, by the mid-1870s, the stage was set for pastel with the advent of Impressionism. The resurgence in its popularity was not merely because its high-keyed colors and rapid touch were felt suitable for rendering sunlit scenes and realistic flesh tones, which is the reason most people say pastel was used. It was so popular because it rendered the flesh. It was much more profound than that. It was appreciated because it was now perceived as an avant-garde medium. Far unlike the varnished, meticulous surfaces of academic painting, as you see on the left on the screen by Gérôme, or the highly finished confections produced by Pastels a century before, as this coipel represents the double portrait. The enthusiasm for it largely stemmed from the rebellion in France against doctrinaire teaching that focused on drawing static casts of antique statuary in the confines of a darkened atelier. The training that Chase had received, and here depicted in a drawing by Sargent in the 1870s, 1875, and that was, a darkened place with controlled lighting. The window illuminates the room from the top, so it would create an atmosphere that was good for producing chiaroscuro. That's a live model, but very frequently the students were drawing from casts. What these students wanted, they were rebelling against this academic formalized system, is they wanted to work out of doors in daylight to record the changing effects of light and atmosphere. Because of its physical characteristics, pastel was among the most profound expressions of this emerging modern aesthetic, primarily composed of finely ground pigment and a white mineral base, which would be something like gypsum or kaolin, with a minute amount of gum binder. It is powdery and thus scatters light, much like sand or salt or even velvet. And the light is diffusely reflected from its innumerable irregular particles. This optical phenomena accounts for its matte surface, which is also what accounts for pastel being so readily identified, even by people who don't ordinarily look at art. It is distinctive, it has distinctive properties. This scattered light and the opaque white base, the white powder that you see in that little petri dish of a sort, is what served to make its tints by increasing its proportion relative to the pigment. It also accounts for its luminosity. Additionally, the powdery nature of pastel readily revealed the imprint of the artist's stroke. To the avant-garde, these features, a matte surface, the diffuse light, opacity, and texture, were far more authentic and uncontrived than those of academic painting, whose high gloss, inevitable yellowing, and smooth, seamless surface that lacked any sign of the brush or hand were no longer considered desirable. And these are two, one by Gérôme and the other is Bouguereau, but very typical of the kind of academic paintings that were produced at that time and the surface characteristics that were desirable at one point. The pastel medium itself had not undergone any significant changes in its makeup since the 18th century, when it was used in a painterly manner, but now its distinct characteristics were directed to another purpose: the radical shift in aesthetics that had taken place among vanguard artists and the priority they placed on technique over subject and spontaneity over precision. Pastel was ideal to meet these demands. It could be worked quickly, its handling was versatile, it could be used both in a painterly manner and because of its nature and its linear mark, it was a tool for drawing. And of course, its exhaustive color range was ideal for expressing modern chromatic ideas. These properties also supported the new appreciation of the sketch, which emphasized a loose, expressive stroke that implied immediacy and revealed the hand of the artist. It was this new art to which Chase was introduced when he left Munich, and he immediately set out to integrate these aesthetic ideas with his well-honed artistic skills and to learn about pastel. That he was aware of this new mode in which the stroke sometimes left visible. I think I have a slide, well, the next one coming up, a slide. It's something that he did early on where he was trying to express this idea of the stroke that's left visible. But this is an oil which has a certain amount, has a lot of transparency, and the challenge to meet this effect of spontaneity and revealing the underdrawing was much more difficult in pastel than it had been, than it was in the other media. And just to show you the example of the new type of drawing where it was suggestive, it was done spontaneously, and there are characteristics which I will refer to, but just to take a look at them now. The top one is Monet, and these other two are by Whistler, who was highly experimental in pastel. So, where am I? Disdainful of Impressionism and chromatic theory, we'll get back to Chase, warning his students to avoid dots of color and excessive streaks of paint or seeing color and shadow. And probably he was not preoccupied with the optical properties of pastel. Chase was, however, a firm believer in art for art's sake, as he termed it, and often declaring that it is never the subject of a picture that makes it great. It is the brush treatment, the color, the form. His emphasis on the craft of art and not what was depicted put him in theoretical accord with avant-garde thinking. Though he was never interested in appropriating Impressionism or rejecting realism, he would adapt its ideas and the modernism they implied to his pastels as a means of promoting himself as a progressive artist. Chase seems to have acquired the basics of using pastel in the early 1880s by insightful observation of these now popular works and by his inherent skill. Always receptive to new ideas, his quest to bring more light, color, and draftsmanly flair into his work started in earnest in 1879 while a student painting out of doors in oil in Venice. And in the same year when he joined the New York Tile Club Summer Excursion, and that's depicted in this oil sketch that he did. It's called A Subtle Device, but he's painting in Southampton in his mosquito tent that he devised. But it really shows him out in the landscape trying to, working on these themes of light and rapid drawing and so forth. So get a sense that he was actually there doing it. That he was amenable to further modifying his dark colors and the chiaroscuro of his training is suggested by the advice from the Belgian artist Alfred Stevens in 1881 to lighten his palette and not try to emulate the old masters. And within a year, he was working in pastel along with his close friend, Robert Blum. This is his picture called Cherry Blossoms, which is a little bit later than this time frame, but he was an inspiration to Chase, who had already adopted it, and together they would establish the Society of Painters in Pastel to promote the medium. This picture is one of the earlier ones that Chase did, and it bears the stamp of the society. It's down at the lower corner, and he imprinted this on all of his pastels, at least for that first exhibition. He was very proud of what he was doing, and the fact that it was like a collector's stamp on his composition was an issue of pride for him. Chase also had ongoing contact with exhibitions of Impressionist art, the most progressive European artistic movement, and one intimately associated with this medium. This is the context in which he first saw pastels by Whistler, Nocturne on the left, and also the Italian artist Giuseppe Donatus, who was a careful observer of urban life and very much a realist himself. So those were his first exposures to this new medium and what could be done with it. So additionally, his personal collection, a source of ongoing study, included pastels by American and European practitioners, and that inspired, we don't know how closely, it's always explained that it was a source of study for him, but clearly living with these things and having these interests that were gradually developing over the years did enter into his introduction and his practice of this medium. A rich archive of material exists on Chase's oil painting practice, but not his pastels, despite his long history with the medium. From the early 1880s to the early 1900s, he proffered no information on his technique or materials, and the paucity of references to it in notes and letters from his students infers that he did not teach it, other than an occasional demonstration. His famous instructional method for painting nudes and still lifes of dead fish that would take place in the space of a morning. Chase's pastels can roughly be divided into three groups. Those executed between 1880 and 84, the second from the second half of the 80s, and the last from 1890 to the early 1900s. The early pastels testify to his rapid mastery of the medium and development of techniques which would apply throughout his oeuvre. For example, this one, a bit of Holland, has all the elements that we see as time went on. He has borrowed from popular sources. The tipped-up perspective is from Japanese woodblock prints. The intense hue is something far different from what he was doing only a few years before in Munich. It's a very vibrant, lively color. He has, in terms of his technique, you'll see this much more closely when you look at the actual composition. There are areas of reserve which unfortunately don't show up as good as they should on this slide, but you could see areas of the reserve means the empty bare paper, and he leaves little sections of it. So this is a process that he would continue to do. It's going toward the idea of the unfinished composition which were often referred to as the non-fini. It was a real category, a genre of works of art. So a lot of those elements are already incorporated into this very early pastel of 1882. And he's also trying to suggest the atmospheric clarity of Impressionist landscapes by applying fine strokes of a lighter color above the composition. Let me just, in this area you could see the white. He does this repeatedly, and later on it becomes more exaggerated. So this has really all the seeds of what he's going to do, or many of them. The middle group, for example, which is from and also that his interest in the reflection of light and shadow was something that was evident is evident in this bit of Holland, and that continues in so many of his pictures. These are close to that particular composition, but we see it throughout his work. Also, I should note that it's evident that he used a lot of these pastels as studies for oil paintings. There's also a possibility he went back and he reworked it. But the point of it is that he really didn't see a divide between what should be pastel and what should be oil. They seem to have been comparable in his thinking. So anyway, in the middle group, there are scenes such as this, a lot of outdoor scenes where he worked with outdoor light. He was just as adept at representing light out of doors or indoors, and he just had a masterful command of the medium. It's a very difficult medium to use. It seems, because so many amateurs use it, that it should be easy, but technically it's hard, and then of course you have to have the aesthetic wherewithal. But he was clearly able to master it, and one of his favorite themes throughout, and he took so much pleasure in, was this type of light reflection and indoors and outdoors, as I mentioned. So this is also of the middle period. The forms are also very modeled and realistic. He does have this overlay of white strokes on his composition. I'll discuss more about that later. But, and then, of course, this beautiful palette of very rich and saturated tones. Very different, let's say, from the 18th century, where there was more of a focus on high-keyed soft pinks and soft blues and so forth. He incorporates that, but that's not really what his palette is about. He sees things in a much more saturated way than so many other people working in pastel. And it is a combination of techniques, but I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then in his later group, many of these scenes are outdoor scenes that he did in Shinnecock, where he and his family had a summer home. They're always representing perfect summer days, but they're much more light infused, and then many of them, like the one on the right called At the Window, they become more abstract in that he's not utilizing the entire sheet to apply pastel to. There are big areas such as the bottom over here, which is referred to as being in reserve, sort of empty, and he puts his strokes over it. So it's draftsmanly, but also her torso and her head are worked up in a way that's very realistic, fully modeled, and in other words, he's looking at two different kinds of techniques, and he is combining them. He looked at most of his pastels, as you could see when you go through the exhibition, more as a form of painting than drawing. Here, later on, he gets more into the drawing or draftsmanly mode, but he had a different take on it than his contemporaries. For example, these two pastels. The one on the left is by Whistler, and the other one is by John Twachtman, a contemporary as well. And you can see this is more the tendency that people were going in at that time, making their works very abstract and airy, suggestive, not really defining what they see, but just suggesting it. And you could see how at great variance he is with this aesthetic. This really fits into this new aesthetic movement, and this is what Chase was aiming for, to incorporate his realistic style from his Munich training with the new Impressionist aesthetic that was much more draftsmanly. And also, at this point, throughout his subject matter pretty much remains the same. They're placid scenes, they're impressionistic. He's really, there's not a remarkable change over this period of time. There are periods when he focuses more, for example, in the 80s, he adopted urban subject matter, parks and so forth, and the docks, but basically they all have the same tenor. But so in a sense, you could say the subject matter has a great deal of similarity, but he did use a wide diversity of techniques when it came to doing his pastels. So they're different in terms of things, and this is another instance. The one at the top is a much more draftsmanly composition where, again, he's left a lot of background areas, and within the figure, there's a lot of all the shadowed areas are areas that he left in reserve, and they are the shadows. They're the tone of the underlying paper. I just put this example over here. This is his wife in a boat in Prospect Park. Again, where he's looking at the pastels and certain of his oil paintings in the same context. And this is one of his more formal compositions, so it just shows you the diversity of what he was doing. He also made adjustments in his palette. There are many compositions which are essentially monochromatic, such as this one in the middle. And again, an oil, one that's here in the exhibition, where he has the same ideas that he applies to oil painting as he's using in his pastels. And then this is an example of one of his pictures. These are about the same time, in the very early 80s, where he's using a palette that consists of so many different colors. So he was extremely flexible when it came to his compositions and the various approaches he had to it. This is, for example, very different than even someone like Mary Cassatt, who basically has the same approach each time she paints. And I'll show you an example of that a little bit later. But he was always looking for something new. And this is just to show you what his four examples from his first exhibition with the Pastel Society in 1884, and you could see how diverse his work was. Also, that he hadn't quite figured it out yet. This composition on the right is much more summary. It's applied much more thinly, and it doesn't have the richness that he would very rapidly pick up. And the one on the left, a girl on an ocean liner, when you look at that more closely, it's very simplified. The forms are almost geometric. So he was dealing with things and constantly experimenting. He was continually experimenting, and leading one of his earliest commentators who wrote a review of this 1884 show, that's saying it was not possible to find a typical example of his work. And this is evident when you walk through the exhibition here. This is very, characteristic of his style. If you were to make an assessment of what he does, you can say they're characterized by their brilliant color and an amalgam of painterly modeling softened with a draftsmanly flair, or a combination of realism and impressionism rendered in his own idiom. His style responded to this taste for spontaneity and signs of the artist's hand, but not having the transparency as did watercolor or oil. To achieve this effect in pastel required a vigorous stroke and mastery of this medium. And I showed you that early oil that he did, where you could see the underdrawing, the women sitting under the pergola, which indicates he was trying to achieve this in other media, and also trying in this one, but it did present many more challenges. One of the notable characteristics of his handling is that despite the bravura of his stroke, there's a great amount of subtlety in all his processes. Unlike an artist like Degas, his colors are never strident or unrealistic, and his shadows tend to be diffuse and not dramatic. In this composition, the meditation, he also does something, it's very subtle. You have to get up close and look at it. But along the closure of her jacket, you could see in the real picture, it just looks like it's a little lighter here. He's scraped away the pastel slightly. Just one of these subtleties so he could just make a variation in the way in which the light falls on the composition. Scraping was also a method of making a correction. He's doing it here in various other pictures as a means of adding another element of light into his compositions. So he also is showing, as I mentioned, the way in which light falls on the jacket. You could see that to a certain extent where he has this overlay of white pastel in certain areas. So that's how he's picking it up. He's also applied the pastel with the point of the stick and the side. He's using all these methods, anything that he could get out of the crayon to create the diversity in his technique. And then another thing he does is that he presses down on the pastel, so he fuses his individual marks, and so you lose the sense of the individual mark, and they are brought together. So it gives a sense of it being seamless. Also, his subtlety is seen in other techniques where he combines water with the pastel powder, which he would have scraped from the stick, and he builds up an impasto. But he never seems to overdo these things. There's a little bit more of it here. One of the problems with showing slides like this is that you need to have raking light to really see the topography, but I think a little of it is evident there. And obviously he felt this was a point worth accenting. He wanted to make it more prominent, so he used this thickened pastel to give a little bit more textural interest. All of these techniques are aimed toward increasing texture or increasing light, showing the bravura of his stroke. Even here you could see the different directions that his line is moving and his stroke is moving in. So that enlivens the composition. And he never really used so much of this liquid in his pastel to make it appear compact or paint-like. He always had the right balance between what is powdery and what is paints. And as I've been mentioning, most of his works have this overlay of fine white strokes on top of the color. So this was his way of introducing light into his composition. It's very different from what the French Impressionists did, where the light comes from below. Pastel is an opaque medium. You don't have that option. And he worked out a system that I don't believe any other artist at this time was using so frequently and with such an adept hand that it never, even though the colors might be in certain compositions where the light, you see it over here on top of the pink, but he does it even on dark colors. Chase did not have one distinct style of handling and clearly took pride in his diversity, explaining that he did not believe in being formulaic. He employed multiple technical methods, as noted, but overall, his solidly modeled realistic forms rendered in a highly varied palette is what stands out, is the overarching aspect of his technique. In his later years, he often drew in a draftsmanly manner, but he still was combining it with realism. Let's see, okay. That you see this technique, for example, at the window and in other compositions where, well, let's just look at this first. You could see in the girl on the ocean liner, again, the whites that enter into the composition to give, he always brings in these strong reflections of light, and he loves the play of things. Even here, we see an example of something else he did. He loved this play of black on black. When you look at this closely, you can see the grays that have been integrated into the black. Here, she's wearing a pink costume, dress, and closely you could see all the individual lines in it and how he incorporates a little bit of empty space between. So the empty spaces, again, as in the bit of Holland, serve to form the dark areas of the composition. On a practical level, Pastel allowed Chase to use a wide range of portable, ready-made colors, requiring no mixing or drying, and thus no need for an intermission between the head and the hand, as he termed it. He believed in working quickly, same as the demonstrations that he used to give, and doing them in a very short space of time. He believed in working quickly, figuring out how to tackle a subject beforehand, even having one's tools in good order, and in perfecting technical skills, so no time is lost in the first flush of enthusiasm. This was also an issue to him in his oil paints. He incorporated a drying agent so they would dry more quickly, and he could do his process in a very fast manner. Pastel is dry, and in fact, you have to do everything once and carefully. You can, of course, make corrections, but it doesn't form a film. And it's really thinking out the process well in advance. It's harder to correct errors. And also, to get the sense of spontaneity was necessary that things worked that quickly. Undoubtedly, this mindset of, this mindset and the preparation that lay behind his self-portrait that you saw before, an amazingly rapidly executed pastel that shows as early as 1883, he was setting out his path. Let me see. Here it is. I don't know how it slipped away. But if you look at it, you see it's a dazzling example of his technical assurance in slashes of white and grays and pale tints of yellow and pink, vigorous marks which would characterize all the work that he would do in the future. His handling testifies to the way in which he varies his technique, building up a thick layer of pastel with discrete strokes for the face, the hair, the collar, his boutonniere, which was one of his hallmark signs. He believed in artists dressing well because it dignified the profession, so he always was extremely well turned out. And whereas all the surrounding motifs, the background, and the palette, the jacket, are done in a manner where he's fused the strokes together. It is not quite the sense of these broad, very spontaneous strokes. And again, look at the way he uses white on the forehead. It's really amazing. It's so well integrated for us in the way we look at things, but when you break it down, you could realize you see that it's an overlay of these reflections that he's simulated. So also, and he is, of course, conveying a sense of spontaneity. This slide at the bottom is the kind of paper that this drawing was executed on. It's called pumice paper. It was actually very old in origin, but by the mid-19th century, it was being commercially produced, and this one won a prize at the 1855 World's Fair. Not that this paper is from 1885, but they continue to use the sign of the honorable mention. The paper is extremely interesting. It's made out of ground pumice, and it was touted as holding the pastel in place, which implied that less fixative would need to be used. He never used fixative, as far as we can tell. And most artists didn't, because putting a fixative on the surface of pastel would diminish its inherent luminosity. It doesn't reflect light as well, so it changes its pastel qualities. But nonetheless, he used this paper frequently throughout his life, sometimes on very large compositions. He obviously found it suited his purpose. And I must say, from the ones that I've examined on view or things that I've seen in my own laboratory, they show very few signs of the pastel separating from the paper, which is a testimony to his technical expertise. There's no flaking in the problems that often occur with very powdery and dry material. Chase's attitude about thoughtful preparation and the little evidence we have, or we can glean about him at work, such as this drawing of a woman in a striped gown, makes it likely that his pastels were built up in several careful stages. Again, he didn't want this error. He wanted to set himself out to do the right thing from the beginning. This is a very unusual instance of seeing an underdrawing in pastel as the material, as I've mentioned, is opaque, and the first thoughts of the artist are inevitably obscured once the color is applied. Here in this composition, he started out with a very summary drawing, which is very close to the style that you see in his drawings of a figure at a table and so forth, and he didn't complete it. But it gives you a sense of his sort of piecemeal approach to a composition. It might just be in this type of drawing. It's difficult to know exactly how this fits in, but you do see what is typical of his drawing method, and then he goes on to build up the composition. You see also her face is really very geometric. It's very simplified into these simple planes. He wasn't really attempting to make it very realistic, but giving you the essence of it. So he would have started out with the pastel, an overall application, and then added the shadows. We see the simplification in many of his works. He's reducing a face to its, or even a piece of furniture, to its basic components. So here he started with this broad area, and then started with the underdrawing in charcoal, and then built it up with the base yellow color and the flesh tones, and finally ended up with the white, which he applied in a very staccato manner. Probably it was also a slightly harder color, so he was able to get this effect by the kind of pressure he put on it. It's a little bit puzzling as to what this is exactly. I don't think it was really an unfinished composition. It might have been intentional. He's also signed it at the lower right, so that says something about what he thought of it in his work, but nonetheless, it gives an idea of how the process may have begun. I think he probably also used reference lines, ruled lines, to set out the composition in most of his works, because they have a very precise perspective and geometric layout, and we'll see that in some other things. But Chase, far more than being a draftsman, and his drawing style, at least when he was only using charcoal or pen and ink, tends to be very restrained. It's so different than the kind of bold stroke that he uses when he's working in color. In any case, but far more than a draftsman, Chase was a true colorist, and the brilliance of the medium was surely one of its greatest allures to him. His collection of pastels would have been commercially made, as the fabrication of the medium was very complicated, and it really could not be done by an individual. And this goes back to the 17th century. It was a task that was always left to specialist pastel makers. Generally, large boxes as this, and this is from about 1885, had contained about 150 colors, but Chase undoubtedly had more, which he would have purchased individually, probably in his travels or on his travels in Europe. Most pastels were made in America at that time, but most of them were imported from France. There were very few pastel makers. It's as I mentioned, a very difficult, demanding production to make them. So it wasn't unusual in terms of his additional purchases for a pastelist to have even 1,000 colors, and in fact a necessity, because pastel is a medium in which colors cannot be mixed. Mixing colored powder, like vigorous stumping, results in compressing it and casting a muddy hue by diminishing the scattered light, whereas clarity of tone is achieved by using individual sticks of colors and linear strokes. So all of his pastels were, in fact, built up by strokes of the colors he wanted to use. And that's why an artist did use and need so many colors. Chase did not have color phases, but experimented throughout his production with different palettes, sometimes using a multitude of colors, I showed that to you before, and sometimes using a more restricted one. He often used traditional colors you see in the background of these pictures, which is something that still stemmed from his Munich training, and he never abandoned it. And here are pictures that were done in the middle 80s, and he has a very dark tonal palette in the still life, the background of the woman in a white dress from Phoenix, and in this beautiful composition, where of course there's a great deal of white in it, but it's surrounded by earth tones. So that was sort of like an anchor in a way for him. But he also was very much aware and used, well, I should say first, he often used the same colors as he always used the same colors that were currently available, but unlike the Impressionists, he had a particular fondness for blacks, and it probably is because he enjoyed the play of black on black and what reflections and so forth he could produce from it. So these are two examples where he's used black as a major element in the composition, but he also uses it in outdoor scenes for little details. Here's the legs, the hair, what's behind his Alice and the baby. So in a very muted palette, he inserts that sort of to give it a grounding. But he also used the modern colors that were then just coming on the market. The background of the self-portrait is very dynamic. It's chrome yellow. It was one of the most popular colors, and certainly a color that Van Gogh and Gauguin used in many of their compositions. It spoke of modernism to use a color like that. But in Chase's case, he still uses it to surround these very somber hues. Other colors that he was attracted to were the modern greens. This is what his wife said was his favorite green, was his favorite color. You do see quite a bit of it in his compositions. It's really hard to pinpoint it. But this, I'm just pointing to a tiny detail. In the midst of this somber composition, or almost somber, he has used probably a chromium orange in this little section in the cuff, just these accents which contrast with it very beautifully. And then he's used, not as a pure color, but he's incorporated the most modern, most fashionable color, aniline mauve, which is an aniline dye, or one of the earliest colors made, the earliest color made from coal tar. He's given a hue of violet to this gray background, and that's really mauve itself and these kinds of grays with very modern colors, and he's showing himself as a modernist also by the colors that he uses. So he was really in tackling this issue from many different directions of being a modernist, being progressive. In Chase's view, Impressionism was no more, he felt the Impressionists were more scientific than artistic. So it's not surprising that he would often work in a traditional tonal manner in both his pastels and oils. I think I'm going to have to go back to, well, this is one of the compositions, well, I'll just show it to you here, where he's used a harmony of greens to create a composition. It's monochromatic. It was the type of thing that Whistler was doing very frequently, and he's done it here. And you could see the different directions of his pastel stroke. The stroke, the way in which he pushes the pastel around, so not only is the light falling on the jacket causing, giving this effect of light, but it's also what he's doing with the pastel stick itself. He's using it for its tactile possibilities. It's also very interesting because velvet is one of these substances, materials that reflects light diffusely, like pastel, so he's sort of making a play on it. I don't know if he analyzed this out, but instinctually he would have responded to the similarities in their optical properties. You could see the tonal changes. This is the meditation. The woman, his wife wearing the green velvet, is built up of closely related hues. In pastel, you can make colors like this by adding more white base to the pigment and get very, very fine gradations. So he's done this with a series of green colors in meditation, and he does it frequently in many of his motifs. So he could use these colors together and create very high-keyed effects. He does it a lot with his whites. When you look at them closely, they're not just white, but there's white that has pink in it, and then a lighter shade of pink, and so on, or a slightly darker shade of gray. This is how he produced some of these very dramatic effects. So the other thing, he was interested in the meditation I mentioned, but he was also interested in modern chromatic theory. Okay, here's just gradations that are shown close together, and Whistler's one of his nocturnes where he's using closely related hues to model a composition. This, of course, goes back hundreds of years that artists were using colors, arranging them in such a way that they could create monochromatic compositions, and it was quite popular at that time. This to show you, what the Impressionists were doing. They were combining different hues together. Okay, so in this composition really represents his interest in modern chromatic theory, which was being popularized at the time. The major proponents of it, you've heard these names, were Chevreul and Ogden Rood, and they wrote about complementary colors and so forth. This is colors that are based on the color wheel and how they are opposite to one another and so forth. So he may not have read these books, but he certainly would have heard about it from his colleagues, from anyone and everyone he came in contact with. And he's used them in this composition where he places these opposing colors, red and green, and this is in reference to the color wheel. There are many, many theories of color, but this was one that was very popular at that time. And of course, there's no right way. It depends upon the interpretation. But what he's done here is he's opposed the green of the tablecloth in the background to the red kimono. This, again, is a way of saying he's a modernist. He's doing the most avant-garde things using color theory. When you think of Seurat and his dots, that's like the ultimate example of it. And the Impressionists were using it all the time. But what he's doing that's different is that he's putting these colors into play in very, very broad passages. He's not breaking it up into little spots and dots, but he's showing it as a way it could be used in a modern realist way, but still incorporate what is as popular as can be. So this is one of the things that's, essentially the color is based on modern chromatic theory, but he too was always looking at Japanese woodblock prints, and as was Mary Cassatt. And you could see in the organization of the format where he's placed the figure against a solid, broad field of color, exactly what Cassatt does in certain of her works. And this is an example of a print by Utamaro, and it's the same format. It's a colored field against which a sharply silhouetted figure is seated. So in terms of planning his composition, not just the diagram of it, but the light color field and the sharp profile, you could see where it was inspiring many people at that time, but you could see a real connection with Chase's work. And these are some close-ups of the peonies or spring flowers, where you get a better sense of what his technique was. In this one on the far left, again, those not only the white overlay, but when you look at it closely, you should see it in the actual picture, there are dark areas of color and light areas where he's taken his pastel and he's done this on top of his basic layer and fused the colors, the individual strokes together, applied them with the side of the pastel crayon with the point, and basically his technique is very straightforward. Degas had every trick imaginable to create his compositions. Chase was really, he didn't go far outside just simply using his color. Occasionally, as I mentioned before, he sometimes adds a little bit of impasto by mixing pastel powder with water, probably, and just applying it slightly thicker. It adds textural interest, and it just is another way of differentiating the petals and components of something. Here, it's in a much more sophisticated way than in the afternoon in the park, where that red flower was separate from everything. Here, his technique is so perfectly integrated. And you see here his topmost layer are the decorations on the kimono. And these are just rendered in pastel that's been sharpened to a point, or he's chipped away with his knife, and he builds up these designs. So it all works together. And this is a close-up of these white lines, what he's constantly using to create a sense of light. In these compositions, I don't know how well your view is from where you're sitting, but you again see this very unusual, very unique technique he developed of using highlights. It's totally different than what would be done in a transparent medium, and on the face of Cosi, it really shows up here very well. He sometimes, removed a little bit of pastel, maybe, or he just didn't apply it that heavily, but all these areas that could be mistaken for abrasions are not. It's part of his way of modeling the form. So he maximized it. Again, going back to this composition, something you see here that's so interesting about his work, it's very subtle. As I said before, everything he did was subtle. He ended up with these dramatic techniques, but doing things with amazing delicacy. And here is the ground that the composition is drawn on. It's on a sheet of paper that was mounted to canvas. It's not unusual for his things, particularly large-scale things, like this composition, which is 4 by 4 feet. He had a piece of, his paper was grounded with a gouache-like preparation, this gray material. You could even see the strokes. These weren't really made by, the paper was made by machine, and that's why this is so large. It's made on a roll, and the length of the paper is endless, but then it had a ground that was applied by a person, and he would purchase it this way. So you could see also the signs of the brush stroke to apply this ground. Here it is more in a background area, and here it shows up in the face. And I think he was probably very sensitive and liked this effect because it added texture, it showed that a person was behind this, it showed the hands of the artist. So it fit into his aesthetic. He also used the same sort of preparation in other compositions. This one, which is called Making Her Toilette, is on a wood panel. It's probably about 18 inches high, so it's very small, more like a cabinet picture. And he applied the ground. You could see at the edge of the panel, the wood panel, that it's just sort of overlapping the edge. He probably did this himself. I don't know if he could have purchased a panel this size. It's really a very individual type of object, but he applied the grayish violet hued pastel to this composition and sort of merges the space with the image area, which I think is also a very modernist approach. He's not creating a real space, but more of an abstraction. What's interesting here also is he's always looking at reflections in mirrors, light coming through windows, light being reflected off the surface of different types of material. So what he's done here is he's made scratches in the pastel. You could see it a little bit, which indicates the reflection of light. And here, just to see a close-up of his pastel, how the surface of this ground did lead to breaking up the stroke, something very desirable because it had a sense of spontaneity, and many artists were emulating this type of application. And here is, one of his absolute masterpieces where he's incorporated so many of these techniques, the various whites that you could see in the dress of his daughters there, and also the dark areas or the area of shadow. This, I think, is a composition where he probably, if we could see through it, you can, usually using infrared reflectography, but it's not always available when you want to do it. But the perfect geometry and perspective of this indicates that it probably was first laid out with a ruler. And being academically trained, more than likely, he would have continued this process because you can't make changes when you're too far along. So I think that would have been laid out right from the get-go. It's a fascinating composition because he's emphasized the draftsmanly aspect of it, of pastel, so strongly here with the wrought iron and all these lines in the background that produce the size, the expanse of the walls. In some places he blends them a little bit, in some places he's just using them directly just from the pastel itself. When you look at his compositions closely, you'll see that there is a certain amount of stumping, which means spreading the color, usually with a roll of chamois or paper or his finger. That was especially common, and it still is in pastel, that the artist is actively engaged in it, and he's, as opposed to having a brush that separates him. But he uses that technique in many areas to not only spread the color, but in his remarkable way to give a convincing sense of the texture of it. And this small detail of the hat is amazing because we see a little bit of the beige background that you see in places like this, the color of the priming. But he uses a little bit of that, and then he uses a couple of shades of yellow and white, and he produces something that you just sense the light hitting it, coming through the windows and so forth. So he's using white in several different ways. One is the overlay that I've spoken about to produce reflections, but then he creates these broader areas where it actually represents an object, not the sense of a reflection. And then in his final years, he worked on these light-filled landscapes. And they're interesting, again, in combining his different processes. What he's done in the one on the left is, and these were done in the early years of the 1900s, he's combined gouache-like material. This is not pure pastel in the sky. It's combined with some liquid. When you look at it upstairs, you can see it has a certain sort of solidity, but it still looks like pastel. He just always knew how to measure these things, and then in this composition at the same approximate time, he's working in a very impressionistic type of technique where the sky and the fields are more related. Here, he's just giving a very realistic sense of what the sky and the atmosphere was like. And some of these, like this last one on the right, is on canvas. He liked that texture, but it's something that goes back, as so many of his things do, to his very early years. This is he did many nude studies, and this one is of interest because it's done on canvas. You could see on the right where he allows the texture of the canvas to show through. Not a great support for pastel because it just doesn't hold it as well as hold the material as well as other compositions. And here in a final, or a work that represents some of his final compositions, it's called At the Window. He's really combined his two diverse modes of draftsmanly composition at the bottom, and with these very free strokes, he's left this whole area blank, so to speak, and as opposed to that, the face, the torso, are done they're very solidly modeled. They're modeled with pastel that has been spread, so texturally it has a completely different effect. And of course, the sense of light falling on whatever it is, whether it's a piece of furniture or a figure, which is just remarkably conveyed. There's so much vivacity to it, it really enlightens the composition. And it's also worth pointing out that the colors just don't fit with the realism. They're very unusual. They're not naturalistic. Today, we understand these colors better than one would have in the Impressionist era, but at that time, it was a stark departure from reality. My slide of Cassatt passed us quite a while ago, so I'm not going to go back to it. But if you look at compositions by Cassatt, this shows a remarkable similarity in terms of modeling the head close to reality, and then the rest of the figure is done in a very suggestive, summary manner. But Cassatt was a little bit more extreme in her colors. So Chase was, in any case, he seems as if he had all these students, and it seems as if he did not have an impact on them. But I think in his emphasis on technique over subject matter, he did pass something very important along to the following generation of artists that he mentored, because increasingly the emphasis or de-emphasis of the subject matter became a priority, and technique and how it was portrayed was something that was much more important to artists. And that definitely is his legacy, even though the subject matter departed from his realism certainly once the Armory show was held. So I thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'd be very happy to answer. Yes? The canvas was something he was commercially made. He's not an artist who makes his own materials. As I said, the simplicity of his approach, the straightforwardness of it, is consistent. He bought commercial papers, these pumice papers, and those, I should add, were all colored when they were made. So the Twackman that I showed and the woman in the striped gown, both were on colored paper at one point. They were made with aniline dyes, and those dyes faded. But he didn't do any of this. I'm saying that because they're exactly like other things that were produced at that time. And the texture that these surfaces had and the very muted colors were extremely popular, even among painters. They would sort of translate these things into their materials. The canvas that the the hall that Shinnecock is on is actually a canvas intended for oil painting, so he used it. Yeah, I think he could have used that one directly for oil painting. It might have had another layer of priming. It has a slight texture, which you can see when you look at it. And I think that was one of the things that must have appealed to him, because when the stroke of pastel is made across an irregular surface, it breaks up. So that added another element of light and scintillation to what he was doing. Yes?
Can you put him in context, not only with his peers, but you alluded at the end, people that were influenced by him? Can you name some names?
Yeah, Georgia O'Keeffe, Charles Sheeler. I'm blocking on it now. There were many modernist artists who, Marston Hartley, who studied with him, and then, of course, went on to do their own thing. That was more in keeping with the spirit of the time. But it's more of a spiritual kinship. It's not that they were taking his motifs. His motifs are really like what the Impressionists were using. He always had his own, bent on it. But there is one on view here at Charles Sheeler, and it's remarkable because that little composition does certainly evoke the certain abstract qualities in Chase's technique, but these artists really went off in another direction. It was a very interesting period in the history of art because there was such a radical departure from what people had used in the past, where there's more abstraction, less concern with subject matter.
We are out of time. Thank you so much, Marjorie.